The desert is vast, endless seas of golden dust stretching from Egypt to Tunisia. In 1941, this barren land became one of the most brutal and unpredictable battlefields of World War II. What many remember as the North African Campaign was not just a clash of tanks and generals. Beneath the official reports and battlefield maps were stories of men who fought in the sand, unseen, uncelebrated, and in many cases, unremembered. When General Erwin Rommel arrived in Libya in February 1941 to command the Africa Corps, he brought with him a reputation for audacity and tactical brilliance. His lightning maneuvers would soon earn him the nickname, the Desert Fox. But for every bold move Rommel made, there were Allied soldiers, British, Commonwealth, and eventually American, who stood in his way with courage that rarely made the headlines. The early months of the campaign were defined by chaos. The British Western Desert Force had pushed the Italians back deep into Libya, capturing thousands. But Rommel's counterattack in March 1941 reversed that momentum almost overnight. As armoured divisions clashed near Tobruk and Benghazi, a different kind of war was quietly unfolding beyond the front lines. A war of reconnaissance, sabotage, and survival. Hidden among the dunes were small Allied patrols, operating hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. These men, often outnumbered and under-equipped, were tasked with observing German movements, disrupting supply routes, and relaying intelligence that could turn the tide of battle. It was dangerous, lonely work, and it made heroes out of those whose names history would soon forget. One British officer described the landscape in his diary. "It's not a place for glory. It's a place for ghosts. Men vanish here, and the sand swallows the truth." His words reflected a grim reality. Many of these missions were unofficial, experimental, or kept secret even from higher command. If the men didn't return, their fates were often left unrecorded. By the summer of 1941, the Allied command realized that controlling the desert meant understanding it, its terrain, its weather, and the movements within it. Traditional armies couldn't achieve that. Instead, small mobile units like the Long Range Desert Group, LRDG, began to chart the uncharted, using specialized vehicles and navigation skills learned from Bedouin guides. But before the LRDG became famous, others had already ventured into the unknown. Men from different regiments, engineers turned scouts, and officers who volunteered for what seemed impossible. One such forgotten effort took place near Kufra Oasis, deep in southern Libya. British patrols attempted to map enemy supply lines connecting Italian outposts. Cut off from support and battered by sandstorms, many were presumed lost. Years later, aircraft wrecks and sun-bleached equipment were found half buried, but no remains were ever recovered. Their mission reports were classified and later misplaced during post-war restructuring. These were the unsung beginnings of the Allied Desert War. Missions that built the foundation for intelligence operations to come. For every victory at Tobruk or El Alamein, there were countless sacrifices made by those who operated in silence. Their reconnaissance informed generals, their endurance inspired comrades, and their disappearance left unanswered questions that historians still trace today. As the war intensified, these early pioneers of desert warfare gave rise to specialized units that would define the campaign. The LRDG, the SAS, and later the American Rangers would all draw inspiration from these nameless scouts who proved that mobility and information were as powerful as firepower. Yet, even as their strategies evolved, the fate of many of these first desert operatives remained unknown. Perhaps the greatest mystery of this early stage is how much was lost, not only in human life but in historical memory. Documents destroyed, reports buried in bureaucracy, and stories told only through fading letters home. The desert itself kept its secrets well. As night fell over the dunes and engines fell silent, one could imagine the sound of wind passing through abandoned camps, the last echoes of men who served without recognition, their footprints erased by time, their heroism hidden beneath the sands. The North African campaign would soon expand dramatically, drawing in new nations and new heroes. But before the famous names of Montgomery and Patton, before the great tank battles that filled the newsreels, there were those who laid the groundwork through grit and determination. They were the first to face Rommel's fury, the first to adapt to desert warfare, and the first to vanish in pursuit of intelligence vital to the Allied cause. Their story begins not with a headline or a medal, but with a question: Who were they? And why were they forgotten? The answer lies ahead, buried in the accounts of 5 remarkable individuals whose bravery and mystery define the unseen struggle for North Africa. As we follow their trails through sand and shadow, we uncover not just their heroism, but the truth the desert tried to erase. In the unforgiving expanse of the Sahara, survival was not just a matter of skill, it was a test of will. By late 1941, the British command recognized that traditional armies could not operate effectively across such vast and featureless terrain. What they needed were men who could live, fight, and vanish in the desert. Warriors who knew the land better than the enemy. From that necessity, one of the most remarkable and least understood units of World War II emerged. The Long Range Desert Group, or LRDG, formed in June 1940 under the leadership of Major Ralph A. Bagnold. The LRDG was composed largely of New Zealanders, along with volunteers from Rhodesia and the British Isles. Bagnold, a pre-war explorer and desert scientist, understood that knowledge of the environment was as crucial as military training. He once wrote, "The desert will test every weakness in man and machine. Only those who respect it will survive." His recruits were not chosen for brute strength, but for intelligence, endurance, and a quiet kind of daring. Operating in small patrols of just a handful of men, the LRDG's mission was simple yet perilous: to penetrate hundreds of miles behind Axis lines, gather intelligence and strike at supply depots and convoys. Their vehicles, heavily modified Chevrolet and Ford trucks, carried extra fuel, water, and ammunition, transforming them into lifelines in the barren waste. The men navigated by the stars and by Bagnold's own sun compass, a tool so precise it became essential for all desert operations. By late 1941, the LRDG had become the eyes and ears of the 8th Army. They scouted routes across Libya and mapped enemy positions around Kufra, Siwa, and the Great Sand Sea. Yet their success came at tremendous risk. A single mistake could mean death by exposure or capture by German patrols. Radio communication was unreliable and extraction nearly impossible. Many patrols simply disappeared, their fates unknown, their final messages cut short by static and silence. One such disappearance remains among the most haunting in the LRDG's history. In December 1941, a patrol led by Lieutenant William Ballantyne vanished while returning from reconnaissance near Merzuk. The team had reported spotting unusual Axis vehicle movements, possibly early evidence of a planned counteroffensive. Then, nothing. Search flights found no trace. Only after the war were fragments of wreckage found, scattered across a dune field hundreds of miles off their intended course. Whether it was mechanical failure, navigation error, or ambush remains a mystery. The war diary of the LRDG recorded the loss tersely. Patrol did not return, presumed missing in action. But among the men, it was spoken of differently, as a reminder that even the desert itself could turn against them. In one later interview, a veteran recalled, "The wind shifts the dunes every night. Tomorrow, the ground where you stood is gone. It's as if the desert erases what it doesn't wish to remember." These losses did not deter the LRDG. Instead, their operations grew bolder. Working with Free French and later Special Air Service units, they coordinated deep strikes against Axis airfields and fuel depots. Using surprise and deception, they destroyed aircraft, supply dumps, and communications posts, often escaping before the enemy realized they had been attacked. In January 1942, the LRDG guided SAS founder David Sterling and his men into Libya for their first major raid. Without the LRDG's navigational expertise, the SAS might never have survived the desert crossing. Yet the LRDG's success came with a cost: secrecy. Many of their missions were so classified that even after the war, their reports remained buried in archives. Names of patrol leaders and casualties were omitted from official communiques. To the public, the battles were fought by divisions and brigades, not by small bands of desert ghosts who operated in the shadows of history. Even today, their contribution is underappreciated. Historians credit the LRDG for laying the foundation of modern special operations, from long-range reconnaissance to unconventional warfare tactics. Their emphasis on adaptability, stealth, and self-reliance would influence commando and special forces doctrine for decades, but their story remains one of partial records and unanswered questions. In 1959, an Italian oil survey team discovered the skeletal remains of 2 men near the Gilf Kebir Plateau. Nearby lay corroded vehicle parts marked with the faded emblem of a scorpion, the insignia of the LRDG. A watch, a map case, and a rusted compass were recovered and sent to London. No one could confirm their identities, but it was believed they were members of the Lost Ballantine Patrol. After nearly 2 decades, the desert had finally revealed a small piece of its secret. Their discovery sparked renewed interest among military historians, who began to piece together the LRDG's full story through surviving journals and photographs. Each revelation painted a portrait of extraordinary courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice, qualities that defined the forgotten heroes of the North African sands. As 1942 dawned, the war in North Africa escalated. The United States had joined the fight, bringing new troops, new strategies, and new hope to the Allied cause. The LRDG, now seasoned veterans of the desert, would soon guide a new kind of warrior through the dunes, men trained for night assaults, sabotage, and close combat. They were the Rangers, and their story would soon begin. But for the LRDG, the desert's silence still held the voices of those who never returned. The war moved forward, the sands shifted, and in the deep heart of the Sahara, the ghosts of the long-range desert group remained, unseen but never forgotten. By the dawn of 1942, the North African desert had become a proving ground not only for tactics but for men. The British 8th Army was locked in a relentless struggle with Rommel's Afrika Korps, and with each passing month, the Allied High Command recognized a growing need for fresh blood, forces that could adapt to unconventional warfare. That call was answered by a new kind of soldier, the American Ranger. The US Army, newly thrust into the war after Pearl Harbor, looked to its British allies for guidance in building a specialized assault force. In June 1942, under the direction of Major William Orlando Darby, the 1st Ranger Battalion was formed in Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland. The men were volunteers, hand-picked for toughness, initiative, and a willingness to undertake dangerous missions. Trained by the British commandos, they learned stealth, amphibious assaults, and night operations. Darby himself was a dynamic leader, admired for his energy and fierce loyalty to his men. He often told them, "We're not here to follow the path, we're here to make it." By November of that year, the Rangers were deployed to North Africa as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French-controlled territories. Their objective: secure key coastal positions in Algeria and Morocco, paving the way for the larger advance eastward toward Tunisia and Libya. Their baptism of fire came on the night of November 8, 1942, in the Algerian port town of Arzew, a mission that would test their training, nerve and unity. Arzew was defended by Vichy French troops loyal to the Axis, and its coastal fortifications were formidable. 2 strongpoints guarding the harbour entrance, equipped with machine guns, coastal artillery, and searchlights. Darby's plan was to strike swiftly under cover of darkness, seizing the positions before the defenders could react. He divided his men into 2 main groups, one to storm Fort de la Pointe, and the other to take the nearby battery at Fort du Nord. As the assault boats approached the coast, waves crashed against their hulls, and the men whispered prayers into the black wind. At precisely 0130 hours, the first group hit the shore. Scaling the cliffs with grappling hooks, they advanced silently toward their objectives. A sentry's shout shattered the quiet. A flare arced into the sky, and within seconds, the Rangers unleashed their fury. Grenades burst, machine guns roared, and the battle for Arzew began. Within 30 minutes, Fort de la Pointe was in Ranger hands. The defenders, stunned by the precision and ferocity of the attack, surrendered. At Fort du Nord, however, resistance was fierce. Several Rangers were cut down as they tried to breach the gates. Lieutenant Edward Cook, leading the assault team, rallied his men with the words, "No one stops now, not while they're watching us." Minutes later, the fort fell. By dawn, Arzew's defenses had been neutralized. The harbor was open for Allied landings. The mission was hailed as a success. General Eisenhower himself praised Darby's Rangers for their courage and efficiency. But behind the official reports lay a darker story, one that would never make it into the communiqué. Several men from the night's operation failed to return. At first, they were listed as missing, presumed drowned. Yet survivors reported seeing flashes of gunfire in the hills beyond Arzew, suggesting that a small group had been captured and taken inland by retreating French or German troops. No confirmation ever came. Their names faded into administrative lists, their fate unresolved. For Darby, The losses weighed heavily. In his field journal, he wrote, "They were there when the lights went out. We don't know where they fell. The sea and the sand have taken them." The entry was never intended for public view, but it captures the human cost of those early victories, the price paid by men who fought not for recognition, but for the mission. The battle for Arzew proved the Rangers' worth. Their success opened the door for further assaults in Tunisia and later in Sicily and Italy. Yet, as the campaign moved eastward, the desert once again swallowed the evidence of what truly happened that night. No graves, no witnesses, just a handful of names on a missing in action list. Years later, local fishermen from Arzew recalled finding wreckage along the coast. Fragments of American equipment, personal items, even a tattered shoulder patch with the Ranger insignia. It was never confirmed whether they belonged to Darby's missing men. The truth remains uncertain, like so much of the desert's history, scattered, half-buried, and fading with time. But for the Rangers, that night marked the beginning of a legend. Their stealth, precision, and courage in North Africa would become the foundation for future special operations. They were the first Americans to fight on European soil in World War II, and the first to learn that glory in the desert came with a shadow. As the campaign pressed eastward, another shadow war was already underway. British commandos, working under a visionary and defiant officer, were preparing a new kind of assault, one that would take them deeper into enemy territory than ever before. Their operations would redefine sabotage, reshape Allied strategy, and leave behind mysteries that endure to this day. And at the center of it all was a man whose name would come to embody courage in the face of impossible odds. Major David Stirling, founder of the Special Air Service. In the autumn of 1942, as Rommel's forces pressed deep into Egypt, the British High Command faced a grim reality. The conventional war in North Africa was at a stalemate. Supply lines stretched thin, armored divisions were exhausted, and air superiority seesawed across the desert skies. Yet, in the shadows of this strategic impasse, one man believed he could change the balance, not through mass divisions or artillery, but through the courage of a few. His name was Major David Stirling, founder of the Special Air Service. The SAS. Tall, unconventional, and audacious, Stirling was no ordinary officer. Before the war, he had been a mountaineer and an adventurer. Now, at just 25, he saw in the desert an opportunity few others could envision. He believed that small, highly trained teams could infiltrate enemy airfields, destroy aircraft on the ground, and vanish before the enemy could react. "We will strike at the heart of Rommel's strength," Stirling wrote in a proposal dismissed by many as reckless. Yet in August 1941, with quiet approval from Middle East Command, the SAS was born, initially called L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, a deception intended to suggest a much larger airborne force. Their first missions were disasters. Parachuting into gale force winds during Operation Squatter in November 1941, half of Stirling's men were killed or captured. But Stirling refused to give up. Learning from failure, he turned to the desert veterans of the Long Range Desert Group, LRDG, for transport and guidance. With their help, the SAS began conducting raids deep behind Axis lines, traveling by truck under the cover of darkness, striking airfields at dawn, and disappearing before the Germans could mount a response. By early 1942, the SAS had become one of the most feared units in the theatre. They struck boldly at Sirte, Agaila, and Agidabia, planting time-fused explosives on aircraft and fuel depots. Their method was brutal in its simplicity: land, attack, withdraw. Over the course of several raids, Stirling's men destroyed more than 250 Axis aircraft, crippling Rommel's ability to contest the skies over North Africa. These attacks were carried out by men operating hundreds of miles from friendly lines, armed with little more than Thompson's submachine guns, explosives, and nerve. Yet, behind their successes lay an ever-present sense of peril. Capture meant torture and execution. The Geneva Convention offered no protection to saboteurs. Many SAS patrols never returned. Some vanished without a trace, their last radio transmissions lost in the static of sandstorms. One such mission, Operation Bigamy, September 1942, remains among the most mysterious. Stirling led a convoy of over 100 men toward Benghazi, intending to destroy its harbour facilities and aircraft. The plan was bold but flawed. Axis intelligence had already intercepted parts of the Allied communication network. The Germans were waiting. Near Jalo Oasis, Sterling's column was ambushed by Italian and German forces. Several trucks were destroyed. Dozens of men were captured or killed. Others escaped into the desert, wandering for days without water before rescue. Sterling himself barely survived. The official record lists 30 missing, but only partial remains were ever recovered. A surviving patrol member later recounted in his diary, "We burned everything we couldn't carry. The sand glowed red that night. We didn't know who made it out." His words, found decades later in a private archive, captured the chaos and heartbreak of that failed strike. Despite setbacks, the SAS adapted and grew deadlier. Sterling's raids shifted to smaller, more agile operations, focusing on key supply routes and forward airstrips. Working hand in hand with the LRDG, they perfected desert infiltration, blending into the landscape with camouflage nets and sand-colored vehicles. German reports referred to them bitterly as phantoms of the desert. By the winter of 1942, Sterling had become a legend, admired by his men, despised by his enemies, and respected even by his superiors who once doubted him. But fate, as always, was waiting. In January 1943, while conducting operations near Gabès in southern Tunisia, Sterling was captured by a German patrol. He attempted to escape 4 times but was eventually sent to Colditz Castle in Germany, where he remained a prisoner until war's end. Without Sterling's leadership, the SAS continued its missions under the command of Captain Paddy Mayne, another remarkable and ferocious figure. Yet even as they fought on, questions remained about the men lost during Operation Bigamy and other raids. German and Italian records tell of prisoners who were transferred, though to where, no one knows. Some accounts suggest that a handful may have perished during forced marches across the desert. Others hint at executions carried out in secret. After the war, efforts were made to trace their remains. A British recovery team searching near Ajdabiya in 1948 discovered skeletal remains alongside rusted Thompson magazines and a single SAS beret badge. Identification proved impossible. The report was filed under incomplete evidence, and the case was quietly closed. The SAS's contribution to the North African campaign was undeniable. Their attacks crippled Axis air power, disrupted supply lines, and proved that small, determined teams could achieve what entire divisions could not. Yet for all their glory, the desert kept its share of their story buried. The men who never returned, the missions that vanished into silence, the heroism unrecorded in any official war diary. In the stillness of the Sahara, the wreckage of their jeeps and the rusted casings of their weapons remain as silent witnesses. Time and wind have almost erased them, yet traces linger, reminders of courage, sacrifice, and mystery. As Rommel's forces retreated westward and the Allies prepared for the final push toward Tunisia, other heroes were holding the line, not in secret raids, but in brutal day-to-day defense of key strongholds like Tobruk. Their endurance and losses would add yet another chapter to the story of forgotten valor in the Desert War. By mid-1942, as the Axis forces advanced toward Egypt and Rommel's legend reached its height, one place became the symbol of Allied resistance: Tobruk. The small Libyan port, ringed by desert and battered by constant bombardment, was more than a fortress. It was a statement, a promise that the Allies would not yield North Africa without a fight. And in that crucible of sand and fire, thousands of soldiers from Britain, Australia, India, South Africa, and beyond endured a siege that would last for 8 relentless months. To many, the siege of Tobruk is remembered through headlines and generals' communiques. But behind those reports were ordinary men who became extraordinary through endurance. They fought not for glory, but simply to survive another day under the scorching sun, surrounded by dust, hunger, and the ceaseless thunder of artillery. Among them were the forgotten heroes, men whose courage was unrecorded, whose final moments were witnessed only by the desert itself. The siege began in earnest in April 1941, when Rommel's Afrika Korps encircled Tobruk after their lightning advance through Cyrenaica. Inside the port, roughly 35,000 Allied troops braced for isolation. Among them were the 9th Australian Division, the 18th Indian Brigade, and British artillery units. Supplies came by sea under constant threat from German dive bombers. The defenders, dubbed the Rats of Tobruk, turned their derisive nickname into a badge of honor. They dug in, literally, building an underground city of tunnels, trenches, and makeshift bunkers carved from the limestone. Corporal Jack Harrison of the 213th Australian Infantry wrote in his diary, "The ground shakes day and night. You eat dust, you dream dust, you wake choking on it, but the lads still joke. It's how we stay sane." His diary, found years later among Australian War Memorial archives, captured the dry humour and stubborn defiance that defined Tobruk's defenders. The siege tested every element of human endurance. Rations were short, disease spread through the ranks, and the relentless shelling shattered nerves. Yet, through sheer resilience, the defenders held their ground. Allied artillery harassed German armour daily, and nighttime patrols crept beyond the perimeter to raid enemy lines. Many of these patrols never returned. Their names were quietly added to casualty lists, their bodies left somewhere in the no-man's land of shifting dunes. One such patrol was led by Lieutenant Bernard Crabb of the Indian 18th Brigade. In June 1941, Crabb and 6 men were sent to reconnoitre a suspected Axis staging area west of the defensive perimeter. They never came back. Weeks later, a storm unearthed fragments of their gear, a rusted Bren gun, torn maps, a blood-stained field dressing. No graves were found. The official report listed them as missing, presumed killed. But among the defenders, Crabb's patrol became legend, a whispered reminder that even in the smallest corners of war, bravery could vanish without witness. As the months dragged on, Tobruk became both a symbol and a graveyard. The men learned to measure time not by days, but by bombardments. Between June and August, the Luftwaffe dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs on the port, reducing supply depots and hospitals to rubble. And still, the defenders held. Their counter-battery fire and hit-and-run raids kept Rommel's advance in check. It was a defiance so stubborn that Hitler himself demanded Tobruk be taken at any cost. The final breakout came in November 1941, when Operation Crusader, launched by the British 8th Army, forced Rommel to withdraw. After 241 days under siege, Tobruk was finally relieved. The battered survivors emerged from their dugouts gaunt, hollow-eyed, and covered in the grime of months underground. Of the 35,000 defenders, more than 3,000 had been killed, and another 2,000 were missing. Some of those missing would never be accounted for, their remains lost to the desert winds. Yet Tobruk's story did not end there. When Rommel counterattacked in 1942, the fortress once again fell into German hands. Many of those who had defended it the first time were now scattered across other fronts, or buried in the sand. But the legend of Tobruk endured, carried in the memories of those who had survived, and in the silence of those who had not. Years later, Commonwealth war cemeteries along the Libyan coast would mark the resting places of many who died there. Rows of white headstones stand amid desert scrub, some engraved with names, others simply marked "Known unto God." Among them are likely the remains of men like Crabb's patrol, their story remembered only through faded field reports and fragments of rumour. The siege of Tobruk revealed not just the brutality of desert warfare, but the extraordinary resilience of those who fought it. It was a battle of attrition, of patience, and of willpower. A fight where heroism often went unnoticed, buried under sand and secrecy. It taught the Allies vital lessons in logistics, endurance, and psychological warfare, lessons that would serve them in El Alamein and beyond. But it also left behind unanswered questions. What became of the missing patrols that vanished into the dunes? Were they ambushed, lost, or simply consumed by the desert's shifting embrace? The answers, if they exist, are buried deep beneath the same sands that once echoed with gunfire and courage. As the war moved west toward Tunisia and final victory, the ghosts of Tobruk remained, silent witnesses to a siege that tested the limits of human endurance. The forgotten men of the desert, Australian, Indian, British, stand as quiet reminders that history often remembers the generals, but it is built upon the sacrifice of those who were never named. And as the sun sets over the ruins of Tobruk today, the wind still whispers through the shattered bunkers and rusted gun emplacements, telling the story of men who held the line against impossible odds and vanished into history's silence. By early 1943, the Desert War was drawing to its close. The German Afrika Korps, once unstoppable, was now retreating across Tunisia, hounded by the combined might of the British 8th Army and the newly arrived American the Second Corps. What had begun as a desperate struggle for control of the North African coastline was ending in exhaustion, attrition, and the quiet erasure of countless untold stories. Among the wreckage of tanks and aircraft, in the silence of the dunes, lay the forgotten heroes, men who had given everything and received only anonymity in return. When the last Axis strongholds fell in May 1943, the headlines spoke of victory. Rommel's invincible army had been broken. Montgomery and Patton were celebrated as masterminds of the Desert Campaign. But for the soldiers who had fought in the heat, dust, and isolation, victory felt hollow. Many had lost comrades whose bodies were never recovered. Others carried the burden of missions that would never be officially acknowledged. The war diaries of the period tell two very different stories. One is grand strategy, sweeping arrows on maps, lists of divisions, and daily tallies of tonnage and sorties. The other, more human story, exists in fragments. A photograph found in a rusted canteen, a letter unsent, a set of dog tags discovered decades later by wandering Bedouins. It is within these fragments that the real heart of the North African campaign resides. The men who disappeared between history's lines. Among them was an unnamed LRDG patrol, last seen departing Kufra in March 1942. Their mission, to reconnoiter a suspected Axis staging area near the Great Sand Sea. They never returned. Search aircraft found nothing. Years later, an RAF pilot flying a survey mission reported seeing what looked like the outline of vehicles half buried in sand. But by the time ground teams arrived, the shifting dunes had erased all trace. To this day, no one knows their fate. Then there was Sergeant John Jack MacLeod, a Scotsman serving with the SAS, who vanished during a solo reconnaissance near El Agheila in late 1942. MacLeod was a communications expert. His task was to establish a radio relay for a returning raiding party. His final transmission ended abruptly with the words, "Contact made, engine trouble," followed by silence. No wreckage was ever found. Only a sand-encrusted wristwatch, recovered in 1951, bore his initials. The mystery of his disappearance remains unsolved, his name carved among the missing on the Alamein Memorial. Not all the forgotten heroes vanished in the dunes. Some survived but returned to find their deeds unrecorded, their unit histories simplified or erased in the administrative tide of demobilization. Many veterans of the LRDG, SAS, and early Ranger units spoke little of their missions. Bound by secrecy or haunted by loss, they carried their memories quietly into civilian life. The desert, vast, indifferent, and eternal, kept their secrets better than any vault. For historians, piecing together these stories has become an act of resurrection. Each newly discovered document or relic adds a fragment to the greater mosaic of the North African War. Declassified files reveal operations once deemed too minor for mention in official reports, yet vital in shaping the campaign's outcome. Archaeologists in Libya and Egypt still uncover remnants of camps, ammunition boxes, and the faint tire tracks of long-forgotten patrols. Each discovery whispers of courage lost to time. A field journal recovered near Tobruk in the 1980s contained a final entry written in faded pencil. "If we do not return, tell them we were here, that we did our part." The author's name was illegible, his unit unknown, but the sentiment captures the essence of those who fought in the North African sands. They were men who believed not in fame, but in duty, men who faced the desert's fury not for medals, but for each other. The North African campaign shaped the modern understanding of warfare, the importance of mobility, intelligence, and unconventional tactics. It forged new kinds of soldiers, the commandos, the rangers, the special forces. Yet, for all its innovation and strategy, the campaign remains haunted by the question of memory. Who decides which heroes are remembered and which are lost? The desert does not answer. It only endures, silent, shifting, eternal. It swallows tracks, erases names, and covers bones with wind-blown sand. But beneath its surface lie the echoes of 5 forgotten heroes. The LRDG patrol that vanished without trace. The Rangers lost at Arzu, the Sassman who fell in Sterling's failed raid, the defenders of Tobruk who never came home, and the lone scout who called into the void and was never heard again. Together, their stories form the true heart of the North African War, a tapestry of bravery, mystery, and sacrifice. They remind us that history is not only written in victories, but in the silences that follow. As the sun sets over the endless dunes, the desert glows gold and crimson, as if lit by the memory of those who once fought there. The wind carries their legacy across the years, whispering through the ruins of Tobruk, across the ghost tracks of the LRDG, past the scattered remnants of airfields and the rusted wrecks of jeeps. And somewhere, beneath the endless sands of Libya and Egypt, rest the unmarked heroes who shaped the course of history, the 5 most forgotten heroes of the North African campaign.